Hello and welcome to your Week 2 lecture, which covers Foundations of Behavioral Neuroscience, Chapter 3, on the structure of the nervous system. This lecture will be delivered in 3 parts. Part 1 is going to focus on these basic learning objectives. First, you're going to get experienced with the anatomical terms used to describe the nervous system. And we're going to compare the 3 layers of the meninges, describe locations and functions of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricular system. So this is all in part 1 of the lecture. In part 2, which will be a separate video, still, we're going to handle these 4 learning objectives related to the structure and function of the central nervous system. In part 3 of this lecture, we're going to address these learning objectives related to the structure and function of the peripheral nervous system. So stay tuned for these other 2 lectures, but today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the basic features of the nervous system. Specifically anatomical directional terms, the meninges, and another important brain structure, the ventricular system, which produces cerebrospinal fluid. So this image from your textbook, figure 3.1, shows the meninges, which is the tissue inside the head that encloses the brain. So you see here is the brain. The meninges are this gray area in the outside. The image shows an opening cut in the meninges to show the brain and its many folds. Nerves are labeled as cranial nerves, starting from the brain and proceed towards the face and neck. And then we have the spinal cord going from the base of the brain down to the tailbone. And there are other nerves emanating from the spinal cord over its entire length that proceed laterally, meaning sideways, towards the libs, the lungs, other important body areas. Below the lungs is, and here are the lungs, is a bean-shaped kidney that you can see. So the kidney bean gets its name from the kidney part of the body, or vice versa, I'm not sure. And the image also shows the cauda equine, which is the bundle of nerves at the very base. It's the horse's tail, a bundle of nerves at the very base of the spinal cord. So our nervous tissue, nervous fibers extend beyond the tailbone, as you'll see there. In the next image, we can start to identify the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is the cranial nerves that are not encased in bone and the spinal nerves that go out laterally, and any peripheral nervous tissue which is not displayed here in this illustration. So basically, the central nervous system is encased in bone. We have the skull around the brain. We have the spinal column, the bone that surrounds the spinal cord, which is the bundle of nerves. The cranial nerves are different. They come outside of the brain. They come out of the brain and innervate the facial and internal structures of the head, tissues like that. And the peripheral nerves come out of the bone and into soft tissue where they gather information and control movement. In terms of anatomical directions, it's really important to understand these terms because a lot of brain areas are described in terms of their spatial positioning or relationship to other brain areas or to the central axis of the body. So the 4 or 5 terms that you'll need to know in terms of directions are listed here. The cortex we've described as being the outer layer of the brain. Directions are normally described in relation to the neuroaxis, which goes from the bottom of the spinal cord to the front of the forebrain. And I'll show you an illustration in the next slide that drives home this point. So the neuroaxis, again, is that axis from the bottom of the spinal cord to the front of the forebrain. Anterior, based on this neuroaxis, is anything towards the head. Posterior is anything towards the tail. Rostral is anything towards the front of the face, and that'll make sense when we look at the illustration. Caudal is anything away from the front of the face. So the first image here shows the side view of an alligator, and you can see the line running from front to back is this neuroaxis. This is an important illustration. It's not by random that we have a quadrupedal animal and its neuroaxis displayed, because a lot of neuroscience, remember, is done in non-human animal models, many of which are quadrupedal. And we want to understand those animals in their own right, but when we use them to model human behavior, we need to understand how to describe the positioning of their brains, not only in relation to the rest of their bodies, but in analogy to what is happening in the human. So the other image shows a man and a woman, and the neuroaxis running from head to tail in the case of the man, and the directional positions from right to left or lateral and medial in the case of the woman. So anything that is rostral is towards the nose, towards the rostrum. So going in the rostral direction in the alligator brain means going towards its nose. Going in the rostral direction in the human brain means towards the front of the brain. Anterior is synonymous with rostral. Going in the dorsal direction in the brain means going towards the back. In the case of this alligator or any quadruped. In the case of the human, it means going towards the top of the head. Going towards the ventral direction means essentially going towards the stomach. So these come from Latin terms for back and stomach. And in the case of the human, ventral is the underside of the brain, or sort of somewhere between the underside of the brain and the nose. Caudal has to do with heading in the tail direction. So in humans, anything that's caudal also heads towards the tail. Typically in humans, what we use is the term lateral, going from inside in the outward direction, or medial, going from the outside internally. So structures are described in terms of being medial or lateral to X, or being in the rostral or caudal section. This will, again, become a little bit more obvious as we actually apply the terminology. So again, the terminology used, the top of the head and back are part of the dorsal surface. The ventral surface is in the front towards the bottom of the skull or the front of the body. Again, this is in the case of the human. and we'll see an illustration to drive home this point. A lateral structure or part of the brain is towards the side of the brain, inside the head. Medial structures are towards the middle of the brain. Ipsilateral means anything that's on the same side of the body. Contralateral means anything that's on the opposite side of the body. So when we talk about sensation and perception, we'll talk about how information that you get through your right nostril goes to the right part of the brain. That's ipsilateral. Information, when we talk about movement and sensation of the arms and legs, we'll talk about how that's organized contralaterally, meaning what you feel in your left hand is actually interpreted by the sensory cortex in your right hemisphere. So that's organized contralaterally. Again, these anatomical terms, when overlaid on the structures of the brain, really drive home the importance of using the anatomy. Otherwise, it's just an organ, right? But the brain isn't like any other organ in the body. Its functions are very connected, but discrete. So it's important to know where you are in the organ, what part of the brain real estate you're inhabiting in order to be able to infer certain functions in terms of behavior. So when we look at postmortem tissue, or when we do neural imaging of people who are still living, we refer to cross sections of the brain in this way. We here have a three-dimensional brain with a coronal plane going across from the dorsal surface to the ventral surface. We have a horizontal plane which cuts the brain into top and bottom halves. And we have a sagittal plane that cuts the brain into right and left halves. So here we're only able to see the left side, right? The transverse plane is a little bit different in that it's a cross section of, in this instance, the spinal cord. So if you take this coronal section, when you cut the brain from top to bottom, then what you get is an image like this. You get to see across the, this is the left hemisphere and this is the right hemisphere, right? Because we're looking at a mirror image, and you see the dorsal surface is up here and the ventral surface is down here. So this is where the spinal column would come out, and the skull would surround the dorsal surface. If you cut the sagittal section, you divide the brain into right and left halves, you can then look laterally from the inside of the brain towards the outer direction. But this is an internal cross section, and here you can see rostral towards the nose, caudal towards the tail, ventral towards the stomach. And you can start to appreciate how the cortex looks different than other internal structures such as the corpus callosum, the brainstem, the cerebellum. You start to see how this organ isn't just uniform, but that there are specific structures within it that are worth mention. And the white matter is basically fibers, and the gray matter is the cell body. And so anything you see inside the brain that's white is axonal connections, and anything that's grayish is the cells, the body of the neurons themselves, as opposed to their projections. And in this cross-section of the brain divided into top and bottom halves, this is the horizontal plane, you can see, again, still the rostral and the caudal, right? But no longer do we have a ventral perspective because we're looking at the top or the bottom half of the brain. So the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we dissect it or scan it along specific planes that represent cross sections, horizontal sections, or sagittal sections. So here is another 3D visualization from your textbook. You can see that the horizontal plane cuts the brain in half parallel to the floor. The coronal plane cuts the brain vertically in half, showing the brain parallel to the forehead. And the sagittal plane vertically cuts the brain in half and is perpendicular to the ground. The meninges represent another important structure of the brain. You've probably heard of meningiomas or meningitis. Those are all diseases of the meninges. A meningioma is a cancer of the meninges, and meningitis is an infection of the meninges. So they are basically the protective sheaths around the brain and spinal cord, and they are divided into 3 layers that you can remember as DAP. Dura mater is the outer layer. Arachnoid membrane is what makes up the middle layer. And pia mater is the layer of meninges that's right along the surface of the brain. There's a gap between the meninges and the brain, and that is called the subarachnoid space, and it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So in the next picture, you can see this a little bit more easily. So here is the brain, right? You see the skull, and in between the skull and the brain tissue are these meninges. And in layers, going from top to bottom DAP, we have the dura mater, we have the arachnoid membrane, and we have the pia mater. And then here's the brain tissue itself, the cortex and its convolutions depicted as the surface of the brain down here. So filling the subarachnoid space is cerebral spinal fluid. So one way to think of the meninges is like a spongy sock or a helmet inside your head, because it's layered and it cushions and absorbs and protects the brain from blows. The ventricular system is another really important part of the brain structure that I want you to learn about in this first lecture. It's made up of ventricles, which are basically a collection of pipes or hollow interconnected chambers that both create, that produce and hold the cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is analogous to blood in other parts of the body. There's also blood in the brain that carries sugar and oxygen and nutrients that we need to help the brain work. But for cerebral spinal fluid is a special kind of fluid that is contained in the brain and in the spinal column that carries important neurochemicals that are used for neurotransmission, for communication between neurons. So the ventricles produce and contain the cerebral spinal fluid, and the brain in the skull floats in a bath of CSF or cerebral spinal fluid within that subarachnoid space. So this next illustration shows you the ventricular system from the lateral or side perspective. And you can see that the lateral ventricle is a big chamber in the center that's connected to the third ventricle in the middle of the brain. The neural tissue called the massa intermedia crosses through the middle of the third ventricle, and the cerebral aqueduct, which is a long tube connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle below it. The ventricular system, as I indicated before, is responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid. The outer layer of the brain, you can see here, is labeled superior sagittal sinus. Immediately below this layer is a layer labeled the subarachnoid space and is of varying thickness. It is thicker at the top. For instance, the brain is below the subarachnoid space, and the base of the brain shows the cerebral aqueduct. And you can see these arrows show essentially the flow of cerebral spinal fluid through the brain. At its head is the third ventricle, and near about the center of the brain is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, which is below the massa intermedia. Above the massa intermedia and connected to the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle can be seen. So this image shows a small opening also at near about the base of the cerebral aqueduct and leading to the subarachnoid space. Basically, you can, by looking at this, examine the various parts of the ventricular system and see how the cerebral spinal fluid circulates throughout the ventricular system. So the last thing I want to touch on today is a discussion of the major divisions of the peripheral nervous system. And this is going to be the subject of follow-up lectures. But suffice it to say that the peripheral nervous system, remember, is everything. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, everything encased in bone. And the peripheral nervous system is everything that is still nervous tissue, but not the brain or the spinal cord. It includes two things, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is made up of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. And spinal nerves take in afferent with an A, meaning putting in. They take in information from sense organs in the body. Efferent nerves send out information from the spinal column to the muscles, for instance. So afferent with an A receives information from the periphery. Efferent with an E sends information to the periphery. The cranial nerves also have afferent with an A and efferent fibers that do similar things. And a fiber is basically a bundle of nerves. The autonomic nervous system is a really important part or concept, frankly. It describes how the brain and body work together to affect behavioral change, to engage in actions that are really relevant for this course. So the concept of the autonomic nervous system is one that we're going to refer to again and again. Unlike how we describe the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system components that are the somatic component. The autonomic nervous system is a functional grouping, a functional set of terms that describe how the nervous system works in two modes, fight or flight mode or rest and digest mode. And in terms of fight or flight mode, the sympathetic branch includes spinal nerves from the chest and lower body regions and sympathetic ganglia that have the effect of sort of preparing us for immediate action. The parasympathetic branch includes these cranial nerves that are listed here, spinal nerves, and parasympathetic ganglia that have overall the function of supporting more long-term energy conservative behaviors and functions. Of course, most complicated behavior and important behavioral functions require the delicate balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic functions, and we'll talk about that in subsequent lectures.